I still remember the sound of that night. Not the shouting, not the breaking of glass, but the silence that came afterward. Silence has a weight when you're 15. It presses on your chest and teaches you that families don't always break with noise. Sometimes they just stop speaking. That night, my parents stood in the living room, faces lit by the flicker of the TV that no one was watching. Mom's eyes were red, her hands trembling as she said, "You never even tried, Rohan." Dad didn't answer right away. He just looked tired, like someone who'd been running from something for years. Finally, he said softly, "I tried, Mira. I just failed." I stood behind the half-open door, holding my breath, wishing for a miracle, for one of them to say, "Let's start again." But life doesn't wait for wishes. That was the night I realized that love can still exist inside people who no longer know how to stand next to each other. When Dad left that night, he didn't slam the door. He closed it gently, as if afraid the sound itself would wake the ghosts already moving in. Mom sank onto the floor, tears falling in the same rhythm as the rain outside. And me? I didn't cry. Not then. I just stood there, staring at the empty space where his shoes used to be. In the days that followed, everyone pretended to adjust. Mom went to work earlier, came home later, smiled harder. I did my homework, washed the dishes, told friends at school that everything was fine. But at night, when the house got too quiet, I'd open my window and talk to the stars. I'd ask them if families could be glued back together. They never answered. The neighbors started whispering. A broken family, they called us, like we were something fragile and shameful. I learned to walk faster when I heard pity in people's voices, because pity hurts more than judgment. A month later, Dad called. He said he'd moved to a small apartment near his office, said he'd visit on weekends, said it wasn't my fault, but his voice sounded like guilt wearing politeness as a disguise. I wanted to scream at him. Then why does it feel like it is my fault? But instead, I said, "Okay, Papa, take care." After that call, I went to my room and stared at the family photo on my desk, the one taken 2 summers ago. We were at the beach, laughing, arms around each other, sun in our eyes. I remember thinking that happiness looked permanent back then. Now I knew it wasn't. It was just a moment that didn't know it would become memory. Mom tried to be strong. She told me, "Some people leave so you can learn to stay." But even she couldn't hide the nights she sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone, waiting for messages that never came. Sometimes I'd find her asleep there, arms folded, face buried in unpaid bills. And I'd cover her with a blanket, the same one she used to wrap around me when I was little and afraid of thunder. I started writing in a journal, not because I wanted to, but because words were the only things that stayed when people didn't. Each page became a version of the home I'd lost. Sentences instead of walls, memories instead of rooms. It wasn't enough, but it was something. One evening, about a month after he left, I heard footsteps outside our door. For a second, my heart leaped, but it wasn't him. It was the delivery man dropping off a package Mom had ordered, a new dinner set. When she unpacked it, she smiled weakly and said, "Maybe new things can change the feeling of old places." But when she went to bed, I saw her push one of the plates to the back of the cabinet. She'd only bought 3, not 4. That night, as I sat alone in my room, I realized something strange. You can live in the same house, sleep in the same bed, breathe the same air, and still feel homeless. Because home isn't walls, it's people. And sometimes people forget how to stay. I looked out at the stars again, the ones that had listened to my questions for weeks. I whispered, "Will we ever be the same?" The sky stayed silent, but a shooting star crossed above the horizon. And for a second, I pretended it was an answer. The first weekend after he left, Dad came to pick me up. It was Saturday morning. The air smelled like wet soil and distance. I stood by the window, watching his car pull up outside our building. It looked smaller somehow, lonelier, like even the metal remembered what it was missing. Mom came into my room, her smile stitched together with effort. She tucked a strand of hair behind my ear and said softly, "Be polite, Beta. He's still your father." Her voice cracked on the word still. I nodded. Neither of us said what we were thinking. Why did we have to pretend everything was okay just to make him comfortable? When I stepped outside, Dad gave me the same smile he always had, the one that used to feel warm, but now just felt rehearsed. "Ready for our weekend adventure?" he said, trying too hard. I wanted to say no. I wanted to say I wasn't ready for a version of him that came in limited hours and borrowed weekends. But I just nodded, because that's what good daughters do. The drive was quiet. The car smelled of aftershave and takeout food. He turned on the radio, and for a moment, we both pretended to hum along, like we used to, but the music only made the silence between us louder. His new apartment was small, neat, clean, lifeless. The walls were white, the kind of white that didn't know laughter. He'd bought a new couch, a new TV, a new start, but the photo frames were empty. No pictures of Mom, none of me, just blank glass waiting to forget. He made pasta for lunch, the same recipe Mom used to cook every Sunday, except his tasted different, emptier, like even the sauce missed her. I forced a smile and said, "It's nice, Papa." He looked at me with that hopeful look that broke my heart. "Really? You think so?" I nodded again, because lies were easier than honesty now. After lunch, he showed me my room. A small corner with a bed, a desk, and a new blanket. Everything was perfect. Everything was wrong. The blanket still had its tag. The desk still smelled of the store. Nothing in that room knew me. That evening, we sat on the balcony. The city below glowed in orange light. And for the first time, he looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that guilt wears quietly. He said, "You know, I didn't leave because I stopped loving you or your mom." I stayed silent. He continued, "Sometimes love stops being enough." The same words Mom had said. Maybe that's what adults say when they don't want to admit they gave up. He looked at me again. "You understand, right?" I wanted to scream, "No, I don't. I'm a kid. I shouldn't have to understand why you couldn't stay." But I just whispered, "Yes." That night, when I lay in that new bed, I couldn't sleep. The walls felt too clean, too empty, like they were waiting for something to happen. I reached under my pillow and pulled out the small seashell Mom had given me when I was little. She said it carried the sound of the sea, that if I listened closely, I could hear home. I pressed it to my ear. All I heard was silence. The next morning, he made pancakes. He burned the first batch. We laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was easier than crying. And for a moment, it felt like before. He dropped me home by noon. When we reached the gate, he said, "Next week, we'll go somewhere fun." I nodded again, watching him drive away, the sound of his car fading like a goodbye too familiar to hurt anymore. Mom was in the kitchen when I walked in. She didn't ask what we did. She didn't ask if I had fun. She just looked at me and said, "Did you eat?" I nodded. She smiled softly, wiped her hands, and said, "Good." That was how we talked now, in half sentences, small kindnesses, and pauses filled with everything we didn't say. That night, as I brushed my hair, I saw both of their faces in the mirror, her exhaustion and his guilt, and somewhere in between, me, trying to belong to two broken worlds, trying to be the bridge so they didn't drift further apart. But bridges break too eventually. I sat by the window again and looked at the same stars I used to talk to. Only now, I didn't ask questions. I just whispered, "I missed before." And for the first time, I felt tears slip down without warning. Quiet, tired, honest. It happened slowly, not like a storm, but like a shadow creeping across sunlight. At first, I didn't even notice it. Mom still went to work, still cooked dinner, still asked about school. But something in her voice had changed. It had lost its warmth, its laughter, the music that used to make even our quietest dinners feel alive. There were moments when I'd catch her staring into nothing, her spoon resting midair, her eyes far away, lost in a place I couldn't reach. When I asked, "What are you thinking about?" she'd always smile and say, "Nothing, Beta, just tired." But her eyes said everything. Tired wasn't the right word. Tired meant you could rest and feel better. She looked drained, like someone who had been strong for too long. Bills started piling up on the kitchen counter. She tried to hide them under old newspapers, but I noticed. I also noticed the way she stopped buying her favorite jasmine tea, how she began cutting her own hair, how she'd sigh quietly before opening the fridge, as if apologizing to it for being half empty. One night, I overheard her on the phone. Her voice was low, calm, but trembling. "No, I can't pay the full amount this month. I just need a few more days." A pause. Then she said, "Please." That word hit me harder than anything else. It was the first time I'd heard my mother plead. When she noticed me standing in the hallway, she hung up quickly and forced a smile. "Go to bed, sweetheart." I nodded, pretending I hadn't heard. But something inside me cracked. I had always believed moms didn't break, that they just bent until the world stopped being cruel. But now, I saw the truth. Even the strongest hearts bleed silently. At school, I started taking on extra projects, hoping to win the scholarship that would help her. My friends laughed when I turned down movie nights, but I didn't care. It didn't feel like sacrifice, it felt like survival. I began to understand why adults always looked so tired. Maybe growing up wasn't about getting older, but about learning what pain costs. Weekends with Dad became routine. He'd pick me up, take me to restaurants, buy things I didn't need, ask questions that didn't matter. "How was your school? Got new friends?" His words felt hollow, like balloons floating too far from their strings. He never asked how Mom was. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe knowing would make him feel guilty again. One Saturday, as we sat in a cafe, I finally asked him, "Do you ever miss her?" He froze for a second, the question hanging between us like smoke. Then he smiled sadly. "Every day." I looked at him, waiting for more, an explanation, a promise, anything. But all he said was, "Missing someone doesn't mean you can go back." And I realized that adults make peace with things children still cry about. When I came home that evening, I found Mom sitting in the dark, the TV still playing softly. The lights were off to save electricity, but I could see her silhouette, small, quiet, distant. Her hand was resting on a photo album she hadn't opened in months. I walked up and sat beside her. Without saying anything, I placed my hand over hers. She looked at me, her lips trembling, and whispered, "You're too young to worry about me." I smiled faintly. "Then maybe you should stop giving me reasons to." She laughed, a small, broken laugh that sounded like something between pride and pain. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh in weeks. Later that night, as she slept on the couch, I saw her phone light up. Dad's name flashed on the screen. He was calling. For a second, I thought about waking her, but then I saw her face, peaceful for once, unburdened by the noise of the day, so I let it ring. Because sometimes, love isn't about answering calls. It's about letting someone rest. I went to my room and lay awake staring at the ceiling. The walls of our home felt thinner now, as if they could collapse under one more sigh. But somehow, I also felt closer to her, not as mother and daughter, but as two people quietly surviving the same storm. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm. The house was still dark, except for a line of light slipping under Mom's bedroom door. She was already awake. She always was. Every day began before sunrise for her, making breakfast, packing lunch, ironing her uniform, and leaving a note on the fridge that said, "Have a good day, Beta." That note was her love language. Short, steady, routine. But I knew behind each one was exhaustion. I decided that if she could wake early to keep our world running, I could do something too. Something real. At school, I noticed a sign near the office, "Part-time helpers needed at the new bookstore." Even though I was only 16, I asked if they'd take me after school. The manager, a kind woman with silver hair, agreed after I said it was to help my mom. She smiled sadly and said, "You remind me of myself at your age." That afternoon, instead of going straight home, I went to the bookstore. The smell of old paper and fresh ink greeted me like a memory I didn't know I had. I arranged books, cleaned shelves, and learned how to ring up customers. It wasn't much, but at the end of the week, when the manager handed me a small envelope with my first pay, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Capable. I hid the money under my mattress, not because I didn't trust Mom, but because I wanted to surprise her. I wanted to be part of the solution, not another problem she had to manage. Days turned into weeks. School, then work, then home. I told Mom I was staying late for a project. She believed me, or maybe she wanted to. We were both pretending, each for the other's sake. One evening, I came home later than usual. The lights in the living room were still on, and Mom was waiting. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "Where were you, Aanya?" I froze. "At school." She tilted her head slightly. "At school until 9?" The lie crumbled instantly. She stood, crossed her arms, and waited. I finally whispered, "I got a part-time job." Her eyes widened, not in anger, but in something heavier. She asked, "Why?" I swallowed hard. "Because I wanted to help. Because I see the bills. Because I see you crying at night and pretending you're fine." The silence that followed was sharp enough to hurt. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she sat down and covered her face with her hands. When she spoke, her voice trembled. "You're just a child, Aanya. You shouldn't have to fix what your parents broke." I sat beside her. "Then who will, Mom? Because he's gone, and you're tired, and someone has to try." Tears slipped between her fingers. She whispered, "I wanted to protect you from this." I shook my head. "You already did. You gave me everything. Now it's my turn." She looked at me then, really looked at me. And for the first time in months, her eyes weren't full of exhaustion or sadness. They were full of pride. She reached out and held my face in both hands. "You're more like me than I ever realized," she said softly. I smiled through tears. "I know." That night, we sat together at the kitchen table with the envelope of my earnings between us. She opened it gently, like it was something sacred. It wasn't much, but it meant something bigger. Proof that even broken things can still give. She kissed my forehead and said, "We'll get through this, together." After she went to bed, I stayed awake for a while, looking at the clock, thinking about how much life had changed in a year. There were no more family dinners, no more laughter echoing through the house, But there was something new now. Quiet resilience, the kind that grows in places pain once lived. I realized then that love changes shape when families break. It becomes smaller, simpler, quieter, but no less powerful. It becomes the note on the fridge, the shared silence after a long day, the hand that doesn't let go even when everything else has. As I turned off the light, I heard Mom's soft breathing from her room. For the first time in months, she sounded at peace, and I realized maybe that was enough for now. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of morning that almost felt normal. The smell of frying parathas filled the kitchen, sunlight streamed through the half-open window, and for the first time in months, Mom was humming softly while cooking. I was setting the table, thinking maybe, just maybe, life had decided to be kind again. And then there was a knock at the door. 3 soft knocks. Familiar, hesitant, the kind that already carried guilt. Mom froze mid-motion, the spatula slipping from her hand and clattering against the pan. The sound echoed through the house. I didn't move. Neither did she. We just stared at the door, both knowing who it was, because some silences have names. She wiped her hands on her apron, took a slow breath, and walked toward the door. I followed quietly, my heart pounding. When she opened it, the world seemed to shrink. Dad stood there. Same tired eyes, same faint aftershave, same familiar half-smile that once felt like home. He looked older somehow, not in years, but in regret. "Hi," he said softly. Mom didn't answer. For a long second, the 3 of us just stood there, like characters in a play who had forgotten their lines. Finally, she stepped aside. "Come in." Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. He walked in slowly, looking around like he was seeing the house for the first time. The new curtains, the chipped paint, the absence of his photographs. "It looks different," he said. Mom replied, "It had to." I stood near the dining table, arms crossed, unsure whether to be happy, angry, or both. He looked at me then, that same soft fatherly look I had missed and hated at the same time. "You've grown," he said. I wanted to say, "Yes, without you," but the words got stuck somewhere between my throat and my heart. He brought a small box with him, a cake. He placed it on the table awkwardly and said, "I thought we could have breakfast together, like old times." Mom stared at it for a moment, then turned back to the stove. Her silence was louder than any argument could ever be. We ate quietly. No laughter, no conversation, just the sound of plates, the ticking of the clock, and the ghosts of all the things we didn't say. Halfway through, he finally spoke. He said, "I'm sorry." Mom didn't look up. "For what?" He said, "For leaving." Mom let out a small, bitter laugh. "You didn't just leave, Rowan. You erased yourself." He looked at me. "I never stopped thinking about you both. I just didn't know how to fix it." Mom sighed. "You don't fix what you abandon. You rebuild it. And rebuilding takes staying." The room went quiet again. I looked between them, my chest tight. Part of me wanted to scream, to ask him why he had to show up now that we were finally learning how to breathe without him. But another part of me wanted to hug him, because no matter what he'd done, he was still my father. After breakfast, Mom stood up and began clearing the table. Dad tried to help, but she shook her head. "Don't. You don't get to just walk back in and pretend it's normal." He froze, then whispered, I wasn't pretending. I just missed home." Her voice softened, but only a little. "Then you should have thought about home before you left it." I watched them from the corner. Two people still tied together by love, but pulled apart by everything it had cost. When he left an hour later, he stopped by the door, looked at me, and said, "Can I see you next weekend?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "We'll see." He nodded, as if he expected that. Before leaving, he turned to Mom one last time. "Mira, I just want to make things right." She didn't look at him. "Then start by not making promises you can't keep." When the door closed behind him, the air inside the house felt heavier. Not empty this time, just crowded with all the emotions we had tried so hard to bury. Mom sat down, her shoulders slumping. I walked over and wrapped my arms around her. She didn't cry. Neither did I. We just sat there in silence, holding each other like survivors after a storm that had returned without warning. Later that night, she whispered, "He'll probably come again." I nodded. "Will you let him?" She sighed. "I don't know. Forgiving isn't the same as forgetting." As she turned off the light, I realized forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a process. And sometimes love doesn't end. It just gets quieter, waiting to see if it can survive the damage. For a week after that morning, the house felt different, like it was holding its breath. Mom didn't talk about him, but his presence lingered in small ways. The box of cake still half-eaten in the fridge, the smell of his aftershave clinging faintly to the doorway, the echo of his voice replaying in my mind when the nights got too quiet. I told myself I didn't care, that I was over it, that his return didn't matter. But every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was him. And every time it wasn't, I felt the kind of emptiness that makes you hate yourself for still missing someone who broke you. He called the next Saturday. His number flashed on the screen, and I stared at it for a long time before answering. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, his voice unsure, careful, like he was afraid I'd hang up. I didn't. I just said, "Hi." He asked about school, about Mom, about everything except what mattered. That was his way, pretending small talk could fix the cracks between us. Then he said, "I was thinking maybe we could grab dinner tomorrow." I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted to go. Part of me wanted to tell him to disappear again so we could heal without interruptions. But I heard myself saying, "Okay." When I told Mom, she didn't react much. She just nodded and said, "It's your choice." But I saw it in her eyes, that flicker of pain she tried so hard to hide. It wasn't anger, it was fear. Fear of losing the little balance we had built. The next evening, he picked me up. He'd gotten a haircut, wore a new shirt, smelled of that same cologne that once filled our house. He smiled as I got in, like he wanted everything to feel normal again. It didn't. We went to a small restaurant, one we used to visit when I was little. The same fairy lights still hung above the tables, but everything else had changed. Maybe it was just me. He talked a lot about work, about the apartment, about how he'd been thinking of visiting more. I listened, nodding at all the right times, but my heart felt disconnected. He was sitting across from me, yet it felt like we were separated by years of silence. Halfway through dinner, he said, "You know, I miss hearing you laugh." I looked up. "Then why did you stop giving me reasons to laugh?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. He froze, guilt flickering across his face. "I deserve that," he whispered. "Yes," I said quietly, "you do." The rest of dinner was quieter. Before dropping me home, he parked outside the gate and turned to me. He said, "I know I can't change the past, but I want to be part of your future, if you'll let me." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, it was fatigue. When I walked into the house, Mom was sitting on the sofa with the TV on mute. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. She asked, "How was it?" I said, "Fine." She nodded, and we sat together in silence. The kind of silence where both people are talking in their heads, but too tired to say anything aloud. Later that night, I heard her crying softly in her room. It was a sound I hadn't heard in months, a sound that made me realize forgiveness isn't just between two people. It's something that affects everyone around them. The next morning, I found a note on the fridge, the same handwriting as always. But this one said something new. "Be strong, Beta, even when love confuses you." I read it 3 times before leaving for school, because I finally understood she wasn't telling me to choose between them. She was preparing me for the day when I might have to stand on my own. That evening, Dad texted again. He sent a picture of the sunset with the words, "Reminds me of the evenings we used to spend on the balcony." I stared at the image for a long time. It was beautiful, yes, but it also reminded me of something else. That some sunsets are just endings disguised as beauty. It started with small visits, a cup of tea on Sundays, helping fix the leaky tap, dropping off groceries, just to help. At first, Mom didn't say much. She let him in, kept the conversations polite, made sure I was always around when he was there. It was like she was guarding both herself and me, not ready to forgive, not strong enough to push him away again. Every time he came, the house reacted. The air felt heavier, the room seemed to remember the laughter that used to fill them. Even the walls looked softer when he was near, like they were tired of pretending he never existed. For me, it was confusing. I had spent so long being angry that I forgot what it felt like to just miss him. Now he was here, making jokes, asking about my studies, laughing too loudly, pretending the gap of 2 years didn't exist. And somehow my anger started to melt into something worse. Hope. One evening, I came home from the bookstore to find them both in the kitchen. He was chopping vegetables and Mom was stirring a pot on the stove. The radio was playing softly, the same song they used to dance to when I was small. They weren't laughing, but they weren't arguing either. It looked normal, almost peaceful. I stood in the doorway, unsure whether to smile or cry. They noticed me and froze, as if caught doing something forbidden. Dad cleared his throat. "Hey, sweetheart, we were just making dinner. Want to join?" I nodded slowly and sat down. Mom avoided my eyes, pretending to focus on the food. We ate together, for the first time in years. The conversation was awkward, full of short sentences and long silences, but it was something. A glimpse of what once was, a whisper of what could have been. That night, when he left, Mom stayed at the sink, washing dishes long after they were clean. Finally, she said, without turning around, "Don't start expecting too much." "I'm not," I lied. She sighed. "You are. I can see it in your eyes." I didn't answer, because she was right. Somewhere deep down, I wanted to believe he'd changed, that this time he'd stay. But hope is dangerous. It makes you forget what broke you. A few weeks passed like that. He started visiting more often, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes flowers, sometimes nothing but guilt. And every time he left, the air between Mom and me got heavier. One night, after dinner, Mom sat me down. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were tired. "Aanya, "There's something you should know." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" She hesitated, then whispered, "He didn't just leave because we argued. He left because he was seeing someone else." The words hit like a punch to the chest. I blinked, unsure I'd heard right. "What?" She nodded slowly. "It ended before he came back, but it happened. And I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to hate him." I sat there frozen. Every memory, every phone call, every "I miss you," every smile suddenly felt different. Fake, painted over. My throat burned. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Because I didn't want to destroy the father you remembered." I didn't say anything. I just stood up and walked to my room, my hands shaking. When I closed the door behind me, the silence screamed. I looked at my phone, messages from him asking how my day was, telling me to stay happy. I wanted to throw it across the room. I wanted to block his number, erase his voice from my head, forget the way it felt when he said he missed me. But I couldn't. Because love doesn't disappear when truth shows up. It just starts hurting differently. I cried that night. Not loud, not angry, just quiet tears that soaked into the pillow, the kind that come from disappointment too deep for words. Mom knocked once, softly, but didn't come in. She didn't need to. We both knew that some truths, once spoken, can't be taken back. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, laughing, making dinner, saying he missed me, and behind all of that, her, the woman who had replaced us, the woman who had made my mother cry behind closed doors. By morning, I knew what I had to do. Not for revenge, not even for closure. I just needed to know why. After school, I texted him, "Can we talk?" He replied almost instantly, "Of course, same cafe?" The same cafe where we'd shared pancakes weeks ago, where he'd said he wanted to be part of my future. I wondered if he'd said the same words to someone else once. When I walked in, he was already there, smiling as if everything was fine. "Hey, kiddo," he said, standing up to hug me. I didn't move. He froze, his smile fading as he sat back down. "You okay?" he asked. I looked him in the eyes and said quietly, "Why did you do it?" His expression changed instantly. "What do you mean?" I didn't blink. "You know what I mean. Mom told me." For a moment, he didn't speak. The silence was so heavy, it felt like it could crush us both. Then he sighed, his shoulders dropping. "I didn't expect her to tell you." "That's all you have to say?" "No," he said softly. "I'm not proud of it. It was a mistake. A stupid, selfish mistake." I clenched my fists under the table. "Then why did you keep pretending? Why come back now and act like we're a family again?" He looked away, staring at the rain sliding down the cafe window. "Because I missed you," he said finally, "and I wanted to make things right." "By lying again?" He flinched. "No, I wanted to start over. I thought maybe—" I cut him off. "You thought time erased everything? That I'd just forget how many nights Mom cried because of you?" He went silent again. For a second, I saw his eyes glisten, not with pity, but with guilt. "You're right," he whispered. "I don't deserve forgiveness. I just didn't know how else to come back." I felt my throat tighten. "You could have started with the truth." He nodded slowly. "You sound just like her." "Good, because she's stronger than you ever were." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the clinking of cups and the faint hum of music, painfully normal against the chaos in my chest. Finally, he said, "I loved her, Aanya. I loved your mom. But somewhere along the way, I stopped loving myself. I thought I'd find something new, something easier. I was wrong. Then why didn't you come back sooner? He swallowed hard. Because I was ashamed, and because I thought you both were better off without me. I stared at him, trying to find anger, but all I felt was exhaustion, the kind that comes after you've cried too much. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said quietly. He nodded. I don't expect you to, but I hope someday you can remember me without hate. When I stood to leave, he reached for my hand. I froze. Please, he said softly, tell your mom I'm sorry. I pulled my hand away. You should tell her yourself. I walked out into the rain, the sound of it drowning out everything else. For the first time, I didn't look back. When I got home, Mom was sitting by the window, waiting, like she knew. She looked at me, her eyes asking the question her voice didn't. I just shook my head. She sighed, stood up, and wrapped me in her arms. We didn't say a word. We didn't need to, because sometimes silence is the only language pain understands. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. I didn't feel lighter. I didn't feel better. But I did feel clear. The truth had hurt, yes, but at least now the lies were gone. And in that strange, quiet clarity, I realized something. Forgiveness isn't something you give for others. It's something you eventually give yourself, so the past can stop holding you hostage. It had been 2 weeks since that day at the cafe. I hadn't called him. He hadn't called me. And yet, not a single day passed when I didn't think about it. The look in his eyes when I said I couldn't forgive him. Regret, sadness, maybe even peace. Mom and I had fallen back into our rhythm. Quiet mornings, busy afternoons, long silences at night that felt more comfortable now. But something was different. There was no pretending anymore. We had stopped trying to fix what was gone. We were just surviving together. Then one evening, as I walked home from the bookstore, I saw a car parked near our gate. His car. My chest tightened instantly. For a moment, I thought about walking past, pretending I didn't see. But then I saw him standing by the car, holding a small box in his hands. He looked nervous, hopeful, tired. He saw me and smiled faintly. Hi, kiddo. I didn't answer right away. Why are you here? I needed to talk to you, just once more. I sighed, glancing at the house. Mom was inside. I knew she'd seen him through the window, even if she pretended she hadn't. She wouldn't stop me, but I also knew she wouldn't come out. This was between him and me now. He handed me the box. Inside was an old photo frame, cracked glass, faded print, a picture of the three of us from when I was little, the beach behind us, my arms around both of them, all three smiling like the world couldn't touch us. I ran my fingers over the glass. Where did you find this? He smiled weakly. I kept it, through everything. It reminded me of what I lost. I swallowed hard. You didn't just lose it, you left it. He nodded slowly. You're right, and that's why I'm here, not to ask for forgiveness, but to thank you. I frowned. Thank me? For still talking to me, for hearing me out, for being kinder than I deserved. He looked up at the sky, his voice trembling. I kept waiting for the right time to come back, but there's never a right time to fix what you've broken. There's only courage, and I didn't have enough until now. I didn't know what to say. There were so many words in my heart, but none felt big enough for this moment. Finally, I whispered, "Why now, after everything?" He smiled sadly. Because I didn't want to die being a stranger to my own daughter. Something inside me cracked at that. Not pity, but something deeper. A small, buried part of me that still remembered bedtime stories, laughter, rides to school, the version of him that existed before everything went wrong. He continued,
I'm not asking to come back. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry, truly, and that I'm proud of you. Your mom raised you well." I blinked fast, fighting back the tears that were already winning. "She did," I said softly. He nodded. "I know you do, Anya. You've always been the strong one." As he turned to leave, I felt a wave of panic, the kind that comes when you realize you're watching something end, really end. I wanted to say, "Come back," or "I forgive you," or "Don't go," but none of those words would have been true. So instead, I said the only thing I could: "Goodbye, Papa." He froze for a second, maybe because it was the first time I'd called him that in years, then turned around, tears streaking his face, and whispered, "Goodbye, my little girl." He got into the car and drove away, disappearing down the road, until the sound of the engine faded into the evening. I stood there for a long time, holding the photo frame against my chest. The glass was cold, the smile in the picture eternal, but I finally realized something I hadn't before. Love doesn't die when people leave. It just changes shape. It becomes memory. It becomes the strength to stay even when others don't. When I walked back inside, Mom was standing by the window. She didn't ask what happened. She just opened her arms and I walked into them. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like something was missing. It felt like something had been set free.
It's been 6 years since that day. 6 years since I watched his car disappear beyond the turn, leaving behind a silence that somehow felt like closure. I'm 22 now. I live in a small apartment near the same sea from that old photo he gave me. The sound of waves reminds me of home. Sometimes I still hold that cracked frame against my heart, tracing the faded smiles that time couldn't erase. Mom lives with me now. She teaches at a local school, the same gentle strength in her voice, the same quiet grace. Her hair has more silver than before, but her laughter has come back. Soft, unguarded, real. We've learned to exist in peace, to find joy in small things. Morning tea, grocery runs, late night talks about everything and nothing. We don't talk about him often, but sometimes when the evening light turns golden, she looks out the window and says softly, "He would have loved this weather." And I just nod, because I know she's not talking about regret anymore. She's remembering without pain. I never saw him again after that night, but a few months later, I received a letter. No return address. Just my name, written in his handwriting I could still recognize anywhere. Inside was a single page. It said, "Dear Anya, thank you for hearing me when you didn't have to. I know I can't undo the pain I caused, but I hope someday you'll remember me for the good moments, not the broken ones. You were the best part of my life. Love, Dad." I folded that letter and kept it inside the same photo frame, because sometimes closure doesn't come from answers. It comes from understanding the questions don't matter anymore. There are still days when memories come like waves, soft, sudden, and salty. I remember the nights I waited by the window, the weekends that felt too long, the way Mom tried to be both parents and still hold herself together. But those memories don't hurt the way they used to. They feel distant, like old songs that still make you tear up, but also make you smile. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that family isn't about perfection. It's about persistence, about staying when it's easier to leave, forgiving when it's easier to forget, and loving even when love feels heavy. Forgiveness didn't happen overnight. It came quietly, like the morning light seeping through curtains after a long, dark night. One day, I just woke up and realized I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't need to. The anger had done its job. It had protected me when I was too fragile to understand, but I didn't need it now. Now, when I think of him, I don't see the man who broke our family. I see the father who taught me how to ride a bicycle, who sang off-key in the car, who cried when I scraped my knee. I see a flawed human, one who made mistakes, lost everything, and tried, too late, to make it right. And that's enough. Because forgiveness isn't about rewriting the past. It's about choosing peace for your future. Last night, Mom and I were having dinner on the balcony. The sea breeze was warm, carrying the smell of salt and jasmine. She smiled at me and said, "You know, your dad would be proud of you." For the first time, I smiled back without tears. "Maybe," I said, "but I'm proud of us." She reached across the table and took my hand. And in that simple gesture, two survivors of the same storm, I felt everything come full circle. The hurt, the love, the loss, and the healing.